Hello, everyone. Welcome to the September Sustainability Lunch and Learn. Today's topic is the spotted lanternfly, and this is one of those topics where we have all experienced them in some way, shape, or form, it seems like, especially downtown. So today we have local experts with us from Ohio State University. Amy Stone, who is an extension educator in Agriculture and Natural Resources from Lucas County will be giving the presentation. And then we have Morning Robinson, who is also an extension educator, but is located here in Cuyahoga County. So she'll be able to give some local perspective, particularly during the Q&A session. Just some housekeeping tips while we're going through the presentation. Please use the Q&A box. That's where you can type in your questions and we will get those answered at the end of the presentation, and we'll have a short wrap up, some fun events that are happening in the next couple of weeks, and your wellness points. So with that, I'd like to turn over the screen to Amy Stone.
Thanks so much. Let me share my screen here. All right, and you should be seeing that. All right,
Yep.
Perfect. So thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm so glad that Morning can join us, especially with her expertise in the field being right there in Cuyahoga County. We are talking about the spotted lanternfly. And so this is a non-native invasive insect that has been in the country since 2014. And it was first detected outside of Philadelphia in eastern Pennsylvania. It hitchhiked to the United States as egg masses on decorative stone that was imported. And interesting enough, and we may talk about this a little bit, and especially it may come up in the question and answer period, is that it wasn't a person that saw spotted lanternfly and reported it, but what they noticed was an enormous number of wasp and hornets that were gathering around the base of the trees in his landscape. And so what was happening, and we'll again talk about how this occurs, is we know that spotted lanternfly is a plant hopper and it is a prolific producer of honeydew or their excrement. And so the wasp and the hornets, especially this time of the year in the fall, are drawn to that. And so that is another kind of nuisance concern that we're going to talk about kind of as we discuss the big picture of spotted lanternfly. I always like to start out with kind of the big picture. And so this is a map of the United States, or a portion of the United States where spotted lanternfly is known to exist. It's updated by the New York State Integrated Pest Management Program. And so sometimes there's a little bit of lag in some of the counties that are being updated on this broader map as each state provides this information and has to go through kind of that dissemination. But just wanted to give you a picture of that big look, or the big picture. And so we know that it started in Pennsylvania, and it has a natural spread that the insect does itself. But you can see where there are a lot of blue counties kind of scattered throughout. And we know this insect is a hitchhiker. And so we make sure that we teach about this in a couple different ways. One, to anticipate the arrival of where it likely would come into an area. But once it's in an area, and I think this really is kind of directed at folks, especially like yourselves or people that live in Lucas County, we have an infestation and we want to make sure that we're doing our best, that we're not transporting it to other locations. And so kind of taking a look at this map is really important, because when we jump in our car and take off somewhere else that maybe is not infested, we want to make sure that we're not taking spotted lanternfly along with us. If we drill down to Ohio, these are the counties that are currently quarantined for the spotted lanternfly. There are 12 counties. This likely will increase this fall as the Ohio Department of Agriculture, the regulatory authority in our state, has been receiving thousands of reports. And so most of those reports have come from counties that are already quarantined, but there have been new reports from outside of those areas. And so right now they're ground truthing those to see if it was just a kind of a one and done, one off where the insect maybe hitchhiked or kind of got blown around, or if it truly is a reproducing population that would then expand the quarantine. We know that there's a lot of TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, social media type things about spotted lanternfly that are out there. Maybe things that you've heard from colleagues, from neighbors, from families. And so know that some of that information that's out there, it could be fact, it could be fiction, or it still is kind of in the unknown. And so always kind of follow up with that information. I've had a lot of individuals say that they've saw control opportunities or ways to manage this pest with vinegar. And although vinegar would likely kill this insect because they're pretty easy to kill, it's not labeled for that use. And when we saw those big swarms come in and people were trying to treat and manage populations on a daily or sometimes multiple times in a day, the use of vinegar could really cause some other issues that with off targets, but as well as maybe changing the soil pH or acidifying whatever it's being sprayed on. And so we just want to make sure that we're following the best management approaches as we talk about management opportunities or options. So always kind of look at what you hear and make sure that it really truly is the best thing that you can do. I'm sure that you've all seen or heard things like this. You've probably all stomped or stepped on an insect. And although this really is a tool to try to reduce populations, especially when populations are low and kind of new to an area, you may laugh when you see hundreds and maybe thousands of them and say, I just, you can't stomp on them all. But knowing that each one you stomp on, we're reducing populations, and we'll talk about that dynamic. And so, what we can do to help reduce numbers, whether it's stomping, whether it's management through traps or vacuuming or chemical treatment, will help lower the population in future years. We'll also talk about the egg masses that are being laid right now and what we can do as a public to help again lower those numbers. We used to really push and promote, and we continue to do this about if you detect, collect it, whether that was the photo, whether that was reporting it on an app or through the Department of Agriculture. I am going to show you two ways to report it, but know that because Cuyahoga County is currently quarantined, no additional reports need to be made within the county. But let's say you're live in a different county, an adjoining county, or you're visiting another county that isn't quarantined and you see spotted lanternfly, we're encouraging reports in those counties. You can make those reports through the Great Lakes Early Detection Network app, which is really kind of all things invasive. And so we encourage people to report tree of heaven or ailanthus, the favorite food of the spotted lanternfly. You can report spotted lanternfly through that, and those then get funneled to the Department of Agriculture. I'm just going to show a couple quick photos through the app because I think it's a great teaching tool as well. It's a very broad app. It's a very large app that includes different categories of invasive species. And so you can kind of click, you can make your own list of particular invasive species that you're looking for, kind of similar to like what iNaturalist does. But this is through multiple states in the Great Lakes area. So in the case of Tree of Heaven or Atlantis, you would just click on that category, you'd scroll through and pick Tree of Heaven. There's images. Whoops, I'm sorry. There's images there. And so it's a great tool. It's kind of an educational tool that you can compare what you're seeing with these images if you don't know for sure if that's truly Tree of Heaven or not. But the other way that you can report, again, especially in those areas outside of the current quarantine, is through the Ohio Department of Agriculture. That landing page is here through ODA, and then it takes you to their plant and pest recorder. And again, it's broad that it is covering all sorts of invasives, but you click on there, it asks for your observation date, your contact information, the pest type, the pest name, the description, and it requires an image. And so either of those reporting tools do require an image or a specimen. So just so you know that. We are trying to reach people wherever they are. And so often in extension, I say that we kind of have some groupies that kind of follow us, our Master Gardener volunteers, certified volunteer naturalists, our 4-H families. But we try to outreach to everyone. And so at OSU, we have a bug mobile. And so I even dress up as a spotted lanternfly to encourage that attention. This particular outreach, we were at the Penn State, Ohio State football game. And our concern was the individuals from Pennsylvania, where high infestations occur, were potentially bringing some hitchhikers into campus. And so we wanted to promote people looking at their vehicles, paying attention and killing any spotted lanternfly at the game or during the tailgate. So let's jump into spotted lanternfly. So one generation per year. Right now, if you are in an active population or visit areas where populations are present, we're seeing the adult stage of the insect. And we will see this stage of the insect up until we get a good hard frost or maybe freeze. And so, we're not sure when that is going to occur. It could be next week, it could be next month, or even further into the season. But right now, the adults continue to feed. They are also mating, and the females are beginning to lay eggs. And so those eggs are going to go through the entire winter, and they're the only stage of the insect that will overwinter. And so next spring, they will begin to hatch as nymphs. And so this particular insect, this plant hopper, has an incomplete life cycle. And so the nymphs begin to hatch usually April through June. So there's kind of an overlapping time. They go through 4 stages. And so that first stage is black with white spots, and they're very tiny or small. And often some people just kind of overlook them until their numbers grow pretty rapidly. And then when you see hundreds of them, it's kind of hard to miss. They'll continue that same color phase for the first, second, and third instar stage. And then when they reach that fourth stage, they actually turn red with white and black markings. They're a little bit larger in their size, and so they're a little more eye-catching. But at each of those 4 phases, they lack wings. So their mode of transportation is simply walking or leaping, and they can jump, 5 or 6 feet. And so that's always kind of a fun activity to engage the public. How far can you jump? And this little insect can jump, as tall as you or taller than you. That fourth instar then molts into the adult. All of the insects feed the very same way with a piercing, sucking mouth part, and we'll show that in a couple images. this kind of talks about the life cycle, just what I covered, but with actual real photos. And so you'll see here, we'll start out with those egg masses. This photo is actually really good because you'll see at the very top of the photo, you'll see kind of a darker brown. Those are individual eggs that are still exposed. So often she covers up the entire egg mass. Sometimes something happens to her and she doesn't cover up the egg mass at all. And so you see totally exposed eggs. Sometimes it's kind of half and half, but it's kind of this like putty-like almost feeling substance that she covers them up. I describe it as, she's a good mom, and so she wants to cover those eggs up to protect them as much as she can going through the winter. And it's like sort of a blanket as such. And so we do know that the eggs that are uncovered can hatch as nymphs the next year, but often they're a little bit exposed more to temperature and maybe wildlife or other things. And so maybe not as many would hatch if they were uncovered as they are if they're covered up. Again, just showing you kind of photos of that life stage with the nymphs and then finally the adults. So let's talk about the adults since we're kind of in that stage right now. We're living that. The adults are about an inch long. Some can be smaller, and often those are the males. They are plant hoppers. They suck the sap from plants. They tend to be poor flyers, but really good jumpers. Often, like people have experienced in Cuyahoga County, especially in the downtown area, they will gather or swarm near tall buildings and they'll climb up and then they kind of jump off or catapult off. And it's kind of a means of dispersal. Now, in towns, that's going to be buildings, but maybe out in more of a rural area, it could be silos or cell phone towers or power lines or power poles, actually. And so anything that's tall that kind of mimics kind of that canopy silhouette, they are drawn to. Just dive in a little bit deeper in those eggs. So you can see here in that center photo, the largest of the three photos, we have uncovered eggs on the top and then covered up towards the bottom. You'll notice though that photo on or the egg mass in the photo on the bottom, it kind of almost looks more like mud and you'll see kind of some cracks in that. That is an egg mass that has aged over the winter. And so as that egg mass is exposed to conditions, the weather, rain, snow, it kind of wears off a little bit. And so it kind of almost camouflages more. And you could see where that egg mass could be laid on decorative stone and kind of blend right in. Those egg masses can be laid on any flat surface. So we've got photos here of them on tree trunks and branches, but any flat surface. So that could be a trailer, it could be your vehicle. I've seen them where they've actually laid their eggs on those foldable camping chairs. And so just think about, them tucked in there. You put those away for the winter, but wherever that camping chair is, where then when the egg mass hatches, that is potentially a new infestation. So, looking at all of your things that are outdoors, if you're in an infestation and are moving locations, looking on picnic tables and dog houses and decorative like art that you have outdoors are places where she could lay eggs as well. This photo illustrates kind of where that piercing sucking mouth part goes through the bark of the tree into that phloem tissue. And so when she removes that mouth part or he removes that mouth part, often you'll see a little sap flow from where that point of access or entrance was. You'll also kind of see some of that sappiness from their honeydew, and that accumulates underneath where they're feeding. So imagine if you have a shade tree in your landscape that is a host for spotted lanternfly, anything underneath that area could kind of be a collection of that honeydew, of that excrement, which is high in sugar. So it's going to be sticky. And then what we tend to see also is the black sooty mold attach itself to that sticky material. So that feeding leaves those weeping wounds on the bark, as well as the accumulation of their honeydew. It can attract the bees, the wasps, the hornets that I mentioned earlier. And sometimes we see that sooty mold growth. Often it's black, but sometimes that growth can also be white. And often you kind of will smell like a fermenting kind of odor as the season progresses. We do know this insect has a very wide host range, and so we'll illustrate that in the next couple slides. But as nymphs, especially because they're only using their legs to move around, they have to kind of eat what's available to them. The adults, though, they can kind of focus in what they like. We do know the key host, both for adults and nymphs, is tree of heaven or Alanthus. And so this is a non-native invasive tree that we've encouraged people to try to manage even before spotted lanternfly. So it might be just that next reason or another reason why, boy, if you have that in the landscape, you might want to try to control that. And we'll talk about that because it's not simply just cutting it back, because you could actually cause more of those trees to respond and come out. They also feed on grapes, so grapevines, both wild grapevines as well as our horticultural varieties in vineyards or cultivated grapevines. They like apples. So the photo in the top left-hand corner is, you'll see they are just congregating along that main stem or branch. This only lasts for a week or so, just kind of like when we saw them in the buildings in the downtown. But they'll feed on the apples and then they tend to go off and feed and then lay their eggs somewhere else. But just imagine going out for that fall family time in the orchard and reaching up for that apple and literally seeing hundreds and thousands. That, you might be taken back by. They also like cherry and hops and walnut. They'll also feed on maples. And the concern with the maples is that if you're tapping maple trees for syrup later in the season, they're going after that same sap that we want to collect. And so there's been a study, and we know we need to do more, and you never just want to put all your eggs in one study. But in Pennsylvania, some of the maple producers saw a 20, or excuse me, a 40% reduction in the sap after spotted lanternfly got into the sugar bush. And so that is, kind of alarming. And we want to make sure that we're doing what we can to support the maple syrup producers. Especially, I'm not one of them, but I like to enjoy my maple syrup for sure. They also have an impact on honey. And you may think, gosh, how does that happen? But just as the wasp and the hornets are going out collecting in the fall, the European honeybees will actually go out and collect the honeydew that's produced by spotted lanternfly, and they bring that back to the hive, and that will sometimes change the taste or the flavor of the honey then that's coming out of that hive. And so beekeepers are on the lookout to areas where spotted lanternfly is and high populations, because it potentially could change that taste of the honey. This is just kind of a quick graph that talks about the host plants on the far left. It talks about the nymphs and the adults and what to look for. And I find this really interesting. So in the spring, if we're scouting, if we want to be on the lookout for spotted lanternfly and you have roses, those are the plants that I'd really focus on. They always like, whether they're nymphs or adults, the grapes and the tree of heaven. But black walnuts tend to be preferred like by later instar nymphs and then the adults. The same thing is true with the willow and the sumac, but the maples, the nymphs tend not to kind of hang out on maples, but we do see the adults later in the season. I mention this just because, especially if you're sharing information that you learned today about spotted lanternfly with others that maybe haven't seen it, there are some lookalikes. And if you look at this screen and you've lived spotted lanternfly, you're like, there's no mistaking spotted lanternfly. But think about before it arrived in Cleveland. before it arrived in Cuyahoga County, and you heard about it, but you just weren't sure if you saw that tiger moth or maybe Ailanthus webworm because it was on an Ailanthus tree or a tree of heaven, it may have taken you back a step and, oh gosh, is that it or not? And unfortunately, we've had people kill tiger moths and other insects that are not pests because they thought it was spotted lanternfly. So this is a really good sheet from Virginia Cooperative Extension with those lookalikes. They also have that for the egg masses. And so sometimes people get confused with maybe the Chinese or the praying egg mantis egg cases or spongy moth, even cankerworm eggs, even lichens on the bark. Sometimes those can kind of play tricks on us. But a nice comparison sheet there, as well as the nymphs. And so the wheel bugs, we saw lots of wheel bugs this year. Their nymph could sometimes be confused. Even maybe some box elder bugs, sometimes that coloring may confuse folks. All right, so let's kind of talk about kind of their movement, the transportation. And so, you know, think of ways that this insect has made it into your area and then ways that it could leave the area. And so we do know that they will hitchhike on train cars, especially in areas where there's multiple tracks, where maybe the trains sit for a while, maybe like in an intermodal. And so I know the populations kind of are tied to some train activity in the Cleveland area, as well as I can attest in the Toledo area. But any kind of transportation, whether that's, our vehicles that we're driving, large semis or trucks that are moving, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is very concerned with populations as they build around airports, and the potential where the insect could get into an airplane, not so much on an airplane, especially if it's traveling great distances, but into the cargo area. And then when you open up the plane, wherever it lands, then that insect, if it survived that, could come out. And so they're managing insect populations as well as Ailanthus populations to try to reduce that potential. When we talk about infestations and the quarantine is something that's put in place by the Department of Agriculture to try to reduce or eliminate the artificial movement or spread of an insect or a pest. And so that would involve nursery stock that's being moved. It would involve Christmas trees that are coming in or out of the quarantine. As we camp, as we recreate, as we have firewood, and even our own vehicles. I shared a story the other night when I was doing a presentation. My daughter lives in Michigan and she came down to Toledo to do some errands. And she calls and says, one of your insects flew into my car. And so when she went to grab it, it jumped, and she wasn't able to capture it. And so she got her family inside the vehicle. I said, just keep your windows up. We know that this insect likes to climb up. And so just go to your next stop within the quarantine, look up at the ceiling on your vehicle, and I'm sure that it'll be there. And 15 minutes later, there it was climbing up and she was able to grab it. So maybe keeping your windows up so you don't have those fly-ins. Or if you're hauling groceries in and out, maybe shut the trunk or the hatchback going in and out rather than leaving it open for a longer period of time. If you're going to an area that's infested, check your vehicle, make sure that you don't have any hitchhikers that you're moving. So, keeping up to date, spreading the word, alerting extension to any outreach opportunities that you think would be well to continue to get this information out. Be on the lookout for it, both in areas where we know it's been, but also new areas, and determine, okay, what's my plan going to be if spotted lanternfly shows up or is on my property? And then report it again outside of those quarantined areas. We do have a website called our Buckeye Yard and Garden line, and we are doing updates on really all sorts of seasonal pests, including spotted lanternfly. So you can kind of tune into that. It's Beagle, bygl.osu.edu, and you can subscribe to get email updates when things are posted. But let's dig a little bit deeper, right? So we've got the adults. What happens when we're experiencing this on our own property? I mean, you can choose to ignore it because it's not a plant killer. But we do know it's an agricultural pest. So, our maple producers, our vineyards, our hops yards, our apple orchards, our beekeepers. So, can we do something to help them lessen or reduce populations? At the same time, it's going to allow us to be outdoors and enjoy our outside without having hundreds, maybe thousands, and interacting with a lot of their excrement, that honeydew. So we can scrape egg masses. And so as those egg masses are being laid now, up until we get that frost or freeze, you can take, a card, like a putty knife, even like anything that kind of is thick and plastic to scrape those down. Now, if you do that now and they kind of disperse over the ground, because they will kind of separate, likely they are not going to hatch, but if you do that in the late spring, just before egg hatch, they probably could still hatch. So collecting those, putting them in soapy water, squishing them, is really our recommendation. There's also a product called Golden Pest Spray or Golden Pest Oil. It's a soybean-based oil that you can spray on the egg masses. The research shows, though, and the recommendation is to do that closer to egg hatch in the spring. So right now, if we would spray those egg masses, that covering is pretty um, solid. And so the golden pest spray would probably just run off the egg mass. But as it ages and it cracks, that allows that penetration in. And so you're going to get better results doing it later in the season. Now, this looks a little odd. I know that I've gotten a lot of looks when I'm doing this, but a backpack vacuum or a shop vac with a long electrical cord and sucking them up is another option, especially kind of on a flat surface. We have learned that as you go in, they're pretty smart insects. They're going to go on the other side of the branch. And so that is a little bit tricky with a vacuum because you have to kind of be agile to go on both sides of the branch to get them. But I was out doing this in one of the Toledo neighborhoods, just checking out to see how well it worked. ODA had stopped by because they were also in the area and they had a backpack. And so we actually went at them with two angles and were able to get 100% of the insects that we were able to reach. Now, there's a lot more that were up higher that we weren't able to, but maybe kind of tag teaming or dueling vacuums, you might get a little bit better. Another option for management is this sticky tape, taking advantage of the insect's movement up and down the stem or the trunk or the branches. They did a lot of this in Pennsylvania early on. And so this one is, you can see, covered with nymphs and a few catches of things other than spotted lanternfly. But the recommendation now is to cover that sticky band with a wildlife barrier like this wire. And so it still allows for the insects to go up and down on the trunk as they're moving, but it doesn't allow like butterflies, birds, maybe chipmunks, other animals that would get caught in that sticky band. And so it's still an option, but we want to make sure that you're using that wildlife barrier to be as effective about spotted lanternfly and not other non-catches. There are also traps that are available. There is no lure that we can put in the trap that would actually draw spotted lanternfly in, but the traps, again, are taking advantage of the insects that are there on the tree. It will collect the nymphs and the adults. This is called a funnel trap. You can buy them, but really it's pretty easy to make them with a few simple list, supply list. There are videos as well as printed material on how to create your own and then how you attach it to the tree. But the idea is they climb up in that hardware cloth or screen. They make it up, again, that climbing up into a bag or container, and then you just take that off, dispose of it, and then replace that bag throughout the season. So let's steer away for just a second about the insect and move towards management of Ailanthus or tree of heaven. Ohio State has a fact sheet on controlling invasive plants, and there's one specifically for Ailanthus or tree of heaven. And I bring this to people's attention because it also has herbicide recommendations. And it talks about example brand names as well as comments, whether you're doing a foliar spray. So if it's a small, like more shrub-like plant, or if you're doing basal treatments, or bark sprays or trunk sprays. Um, and a lot of people I know are cautious about the use of pesticides, specifically herbicides. But this is one that has a lot of stored energy in the root system. And we know through experience that if you have one ailanthus on your property and cut that one down, and thinking you're doing the right thing, you will likely have 20, 30, 40 trees that come up from the root sprouts. And so when I was young and started in extension, we had a forester who has since retired, but he said, you know, Amy, when you cut down a tree of heaven, hundreds of its relatives come to the funeral. And that's always kind of stuck in my head. And so it's not so much a sprout on the trunk that we sometimes see when we remove plants in the landscape. We cut it down and then there's some suckers that come off that trunk. That will happen, but they're going to come up where the roots are. And so that's potentially throughout the landscape or, wherever that plant was grown. So here are some treatments that you can do. And that is all in the fact sheet that describes the different methods. So I'd highly recommend that fact sheet. So if we look back kind of at the holistic approach. So we don't want to move any stage of spotted lanternfly. We want to try to restrict that artificial spread of the insect. We can scrape and destroy eggs pretty much all season long, except June, July, and August, when the eggs have already been hatched from the last year, but not have been laid for the upcoming year. We can spray with the horticulture or dormant oils on the egg masses themselves. We could use the circle traps or the funnel traps that I described. We could do contact insecticides for the insect, but no, and you've experienced it likely. I mean, these insects are out all season long. And so when you use a contact insecticide, it takes care of the insects that are there at a given time, but they're probably going to move and come back in. And so sometimes systemic insecticides are very beneficial because it's in the plant where they're feeding. And when they feed, then they come in contact with that insecticide. What's really important about the use of systemic applications or systemic insecticides is that you never want to apply that insecticide either before or during plant bloom, with the potential of it moving into the flower and impacting our pollinators. But once the flower is done, the bees aren't going to be visiting that plant in that manner. And so then the insects that are feeding in the phloem would be the likely target there. In the Penn State Management Guide that we're still referring people to and using, it really breaks down all the different insecticide options. And so you can read through that material and, make that decision if this is the option that you want to do. It talks about the toxicity to birds and fish and bees. And then it talks about the application method and then your activity about the insect or against the insect, and then the residual activity. It also then lists these are the contact insecticides. And you can see here the horticultural oils, the insecticidal soaps, the pyrethrins, the neem oil. Um, the natural pyrethrins do give excellent control, but their residual activity is poor. And so you'd have to reapply as new insects move into the area. And so I know that I talk really fast, so I hope that you were able to enjoy that, but also get a lot of information out of it. I know it's recorded, so you can go back and listen to any parts that we missed. But I wanted to make sure that we left enough time today to answer questions that you have about your spotted lanternfly experiences or questions that you've thought of as you see these or you're hearing about it. And while we're answering those questions or having some additional discussions, and I want Morny to jump in and kind of talk about what she's seen in the county and maybe where she's getting the phone calls from, our contact information is on the screen. And please, jot that down and feel free to reach out to either one of us.
Okay, great. Thank you, Amy. That was really insightful and helpful. It looks like Morning has done an amazing job of answering the questions as they've been coming in through the Q&A feature. Um, but we do have someone who has raised their hand. So I will go ahead and allow Jacqueline Patterson to go ahead and talk. So Jacqueline, I hope you're ready. I will give you that power right now. Okay, Jacqueline, are you there?
Sorry about that. Actually, my question was way before you even started. So you've long since answered it, but I have seen quite a few of them. I'm in the Midtown area of Cleveland, at 40th and Euclid, and I'm not sure who's on the call, but I've seen quite a few of them near our building, and our building's only 3 stories high, but they are in the parking lot. And I didn't want to kill them, but now I know the significance of it. So thank you for allowing me to unmute. They're beautiful bugs. It's too bad they're so destructive.
Absolutely. And you bring up a really good point. I mean, they are beautiful. Um, but being in a parking lot, a high traveled area, they could easily hitchhike and jump into your vehicle or on your vehicle. And so trying to do our best to try to minimize that spread is really important and something that we can all be part of.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Okay, we have hands up from Valerie Katz. And let me just, okay, Valerie, I think you can go ahead and speak now.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was just curious, are we seeing any local predators start to prey on these little guys?
Yeah, I'll jump in and then Morning if you've seen anything locally too, if you have anything that you want to add. So we've seen praying mantis, we've seen some like wasp and hornets. Um, but not to the extent where they're going to manage, especially at high populations. There are some birds that we've seen that will eat them. In fact, Cornell is doing a citizen science project, or at least they were, that we're encouraging people if they see that interaction of a bird and spotted lanternfly to snap a photo and report it so they can have some documentation and what percentage of spotted lanternfly are being taken out by birds. The other thing that we're noticing is there is a disease called, or a fungus called Bavaria. It's in the soil and it will impact other insects. But what it looks like when it kills spotted lanternfly is almost kind of like a cottony mass or fluff around the insect. And then, of course, they're dead, they're not moving. And so scientists are looking at that as a possibility for maybe a biocontrol. And so while we have some things that are on the horizon, it's when we have these outbreaks where there's so many that often the biocontrols come up just a little bit short. But as we experience kind of the highs and then ultimately the low in a population, those might be able to help us keep that insect in check at those lower levels. So great question.
Okay, and we have a question in the Q&A. Trevor asks, I know that Amy mentioned removal of Tree of Heaven and not just cutting it back. What is the best way to remove Tree of Heaven?
Yeah, so what a recommendation, and that fact sheet will really spell it out, is if you would treat the tree with a systemic herbicide that would then get moved through the plant into the roots to try to reduce the amount of sprouts that you'll have. And doing it in the fall is actually an ideal time because think about all of that food, all of that, the storage is going down to the root system. And so making that application of an herbicide, I mean, everything's going in that direction. So we get the most effective results. You let that tree stand for a week or two. It'll start to, you'll see the canopy decline and die. And then you can go ahead and cut it down. And hopefully you're going to see a reduction in the sprouts that come up. So perfect time of the year to jump on that if you can.
Okay, and Amy, I will go ahead and send out that fact sheet to everyone who has registered for the webinar today. So you'll have that in your inboxes early next week. Let's see, we have another question here from Lauren Hodges. Is there any data publicly available regarding reports of sightings in Ohio? Does the GLEDN app provide that info?
Yeah, so you can actually go to two different locations. So the Glidden app, if you go to the EDD maps, so it's early detection map. So just type in EDD. You can do a search for just spotted lanternfly, and it will tell you where we've received reports. Now, the downside of that is if it's here, but no reports have been made through the app, then it's not going to show up, but it doesn't mean that spotted lanternfly isn't there. Additionally, the Department of Agriculture just recently put up a map that has all of their reports that have come in through ODA, which is very helpful, and it's a little bit more robust. So more people were making the reports directly to them through their website. And so between those two maps, and the goal is to then hopefully kind of marry that data. So then there would be just one location, but right now you'd have to look at two different sites.
Okay, great. Next question. I saw a recent article that they are attracted to the vibrations of power lines, 60 hertz. Has this been evaluated locally for traps?
So really good question. I am not aware of any research in Ohio on that. The exciting news is the researchers are actually going to be gathering in Worcester, Ohio in a few weeks. And so the idea is for each researcher to report on what they have been finding or what they're seeing, but then also get those folks all in the same room so they can have conversations about where that research needs to go, what's the next step. So I'm guessing that that might be a conversation that they're having in that room in October. But I'm sure that there are scientists somewhere that are already kind of working on that. There's another trap that I didn't mention. It's called the lampshade trap, and you can put that in a search engine. The idea of the lampshade trap is that it actually is a place where the female would find to lay eggs. And so it's not going to capture the insects, but the idea is they draw the females in as a place to lay eggs, and then you remove the trap. And instead of egg masses being laid from the low part of the tree way up to the top, they're congregated where this lampshade was. So she's seeking out kind of protection for her eggs. And so that trap provides that protection. And so Michigan State actually is doing some research in the Toledo area. And the research started in Pennsylvania, so they're doing some modifications. But a lot of the scientists think that that might be something to add our tools in our toolbox to control this insect.
Okay, thank you. Doreen Mittiger asks a really good question. I am planning to pick grapes and apples at an orchard in Geauga County, east of Cuyahoga County. What should I do to control the risk of taking any with me and the fruit?
Really good question. So checking your vehicle before you leave, just to make sure you don't have any hitchhikers. I've been in situations where populations have been really heavy where I'm leaving, and I actually will go through a car wash. I mean, that kind of is on the, you know, the high end of, I mean, I don't expect everybody to wash their car every single day unless you want to use that for an excuse. But if you are in a high population, you could go through the car wash that will wash off even insects that have gotten up high and are kind of hiding. But really just taking a good look at your car, your vehicle, when you arrive at the location, again, just another quick look. Make sure that you don't have any hitchhikers on yourself or any of, if you're taking a bag out with you to the orchard. And then hopefully it's not there, but again, just kind of paying attention. And if you do see something there in Cuyahoga County, because that's not currently quarantined, you'd want to make a report of that infestation or that insect if you did see one.
Okay, and then, talking about quarantine again, Lottie Gray asks that she understands that Cuyahoga is quarantined, but what does that exactly mean as far as management?
So the management, nobody is going to tell the general public that they have to manage for spotted lanternfly. It's going to be a very personal decision on what tools that you use to try to reduce populations if that's what you choose to do. But if you owned a nursery, for example, that quarantine then would kind of add a level of requirements that you would have to do before any product that would be able to move spotted lanternfly leaves the quarantine, especially as it goes out into an unregulated area. So, for example, if there's a Christmas tree grower, they would have to have those trees inspected visually to make sure that there were no spotted lanternfly or spotted lanternfly egg masses when those trees left the quarantine. So it's a means to try to reduce the artificial spread. In Pennsylvania, all of the like truck drivers, delivery folks have to go through training and do reporting, self-reporting, that they're looking at their vehicles going in and out of quarantines, again, to reduce that artificial spread.
Okay, and we have a great question here. Can we teach this to children?
Morning, have you done any youth programming?
Yeah, so our master gardeners actually have done some great work with their school programs. They give the kids these brightly colored fly swatters and they take them out after their vegetable garden lessons, and they go and they swat lanternflies. And it's just a fun activity to get them moving, to get them engaged. They have a chance to educate them in general about invasive species, and the kids have fun as well.
Great. Another question came in. Does the concern become less during the winter season?
So I would say it's less in a way because we're not seeing them, right? They're not active. They're not going to move from that site where their eggs are. But if we as humans move where that egg mass is, the risk is potentially very high, especially if it's going outside of the infestation. And so it tends not to be on our minds because we're not seeing the adults moving around. The eggs are there, but they're not, as obvious. But we've got to stay on top of it really 12 months out of the year. And there are always management options throughout those 12 months.
Okay, great. Let's see. It looks like we have a hand raised. This was Sadiat Hassan. You asked the question about teaching this to children, but I will go ahead and allow you to talk in case you have a deeper question to ask.
I think she just answered my question. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
So I think the lady just answered my question because we actually have the flies around our house, and we just detected couples of those flies at Campus International School. So the kids were trying to kill them. And I know that my kids, they love anything that has to do with bugs, insects, they will play around with it. So, you know, like, I just want to know how we can manage that with kids. Because, you know, they will touch insects, they will bring it to the house, they play around, and then they always do transfer it around. So that was why I was asking the question that can we teach this to children so we can know what and what to tell them, you know, because I don't know if it is something that can harm them, you know.
So spotted lanternfly itself will not bite or cause any kind of human health concern. So that's a good thing that we're aware of. Um, and I always encourage folks. I was just in a second grade class here in the city of Toledo talking about spotted lanternfly because they were engaging in the spotted lanternfly stomp on the playground because they had a lot of insects there on the playground. We always talk about the beneficial insects and that, yes, we're focusing on managing this particular insect, but for the most part, we want to live with insects and we depend on insects. And so we want to make sure that insects still have a very good name and they're out protecting most of our insects, but then managing the ones that we need to. And Rob, Morning, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's a great idea to make sure that they understand the difference between beneficials and invasives. And it's also a good opportunity, depending on the age group that you're working with, to do a little bit of an entomology lesson. You can go through and talk to them about the different life stages of the insect if you've got enough specimens. And you could do the same with some of the beneficials that you see as well, but making sure that they're still alive, of course.
Okay, we have one last question here. As a smart hitchhiker and protector of eggs, is there a product that can be used on a vehicle to deter hitchhiking?
Boy, that's a really good question. I'm not aware of anything that you could put on your vehicle. Just that, scouting and looking is probably the best means of management for that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Amy and Morning. That was a lot of really good information. For all of those who are attending right now or watching the recording, I will be sending out a follow-up email that outlines the presentation, but also has some of those extra materials. So the fact sheet, for example, about Tree of Heaven. And it will also include the contact information for Amy and Morning. So with that, I'd like to just share my slides real quick and make sure that you are getting your wellness points. And then also so that you can learn about a couple of events that are coming up that are exciting. So backyard composting. There is a session next week. I know this was a very popular topic when we had a lunch and learn a few months back. So you can do some in-person learning or an online option. And that is through the Solid Waste District. And coming up Friday, this is something that those of you who are downtown or near downtown, this would be a great opportunity to participate in Walk to a Park Day at Canal Basin Park. It's from 4 to 7 o'clock, but it's a great way to see what's going on with park development right on our river. And that is run through Canalway Partners. And there's also the Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District Stormwater Runoff that is this coming weekend. And another solid waste district program is a special waste collection for TV recycling. I know that's a tough to recycle item, but there is an event on October 12th. This one is important because it does require registration. So be sure to check that out if you're interested. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't invite you to the next Lunch and Learn, which is on the topic of recycling right in Cuyahoga County. November is America Recycles Month, so this is kind of in advance of that, but it's a great way to get all of your recycling questions answered. The Solid Waste District will be here to answer all those questions, and generally, this is another opportunity for you to just connect with the great resources that we have here in Cuyahoga County. And with that, I thank everyone for attending, especially to our speakers, Morning and Amy. Again, invaluable information, explains quite a lot of mystery that we've been experiencing these last couple of weeks with these critters. And here are the wellness points. So I'll leave this up for a couple of moments, but please do also fill out the survey that follows the webinar. There's only 2 questions this month, so very short and sweet, but we love to get your feedback on what topics are important to you, and we will do our best to get that information out over the next year as we're putting our calendar together. So thank you again, and have a great afternoon.